Thank you all for joining us. Um, yeah, we're delighted to have our wonderful presenter, Terry Brockie, kick off our language and culture series. Thank you, Joan, for starting the recording. Thank you all for being here, and I won't make this too long. Thank you, Terry, and I'll let you take it away and share screen as you will.
Well, hey, be dotset nähdä se, no, ne nähdä ketä no, niin hi tän, niin nän, no, kine, no, inan niin että on, niin hani kaawu, niin no, Shirley Ashton, niin no, nabwas, Leo Brockie, nähäsik, näbisip, basnäkkä, Neep, Ayon, no, James Ashton, Marjorie Russell. That day, no. Hello, I just wanted to greet you in my language, and basically, I carry the name Red Belt. That's my name. Terry Brockie is my English name, you could say, I guess. But my name is Beto. It's Red Belt. That's what I was gifted to me. I live at Fort Belknap Indian Reservation. I'm a White Clay, often known as Aaniiih, and then Grovon of the Prairie Falls Indians, Waterfall Indians. I mean, there's like all these names of us that we have, and oh yeah, Grovon for a big belly because of a misnomer of sign, and so there's lots of different names for us, but we call ourselves Aaniiih, which means it's a derivative of Aak, which means white clay, and Inen means a man, and so we say Aaniiih. It means people, white clay people, and and so one of the things that I have two children, Itabyan Nabasnakya, Big Chief and Truth are their names, and they attend MSU. And my wife is of the Atdenen. She's Dene. In our language, we call them sheepmen. Because it was kind of interesting because just about 2 months ago, we found an old document from the early 1800s, like right at 1801, and there was a list of all of these old names of different tribes that we didn't even have. We didn't have the names of them, and luckily we found this document that had all these names. But my father is My Bear, the late Leo Brockie Sr. My mother is Shirley Ashton Brockie, and my on my father's side, um, I come from Basnack. Yeah, Big Chief. My son carries his name, and Ayon is like dentalium shell, long shell is what we call it. That was her name, Alma Skinner. And I'm a Esanathano or a Wawa Thanatano. I'm a Nabin. My clan is they call us fast travelers, or another name is slippery lodge poles, because we traveled so fast. The ends of our travel is were slick. That was the kind of teasing. We always have teasing in our way of being. But I was asked by Matthew, and I just want to thank the Office of Public Instruction for asking me to present today. And I'm very honored to be able to help out and what little I understand and know, and I just want to welcome everyone here. I see a lot of people from OPI, but then I also see a lot of people from the various communities across our reservations, and I just for language teachers, I don't know if there's any language teachers in here, or if there's people that I know. I see Jessica. I know she helps out in Havre Public Schools, but really want to encourage each and every one of you as educators, as support staff to your schools. You represent each of the school districts, and our native children really look to you often as good role models, and they see you as professionally educated. They see you as carrying yourself in a good way, and so in that realm, I just want to commend each of you. Today, I thought I know Matthew talked to me about a little bit about teaching styles of there's some class 7 teachers perhaps on here and teaching styles and and then secondly I see Annette there, and Annette at the time way back in the day was part of a teacher training program. And just to kind of give you a background of myself, I was a class 7 teacher for many, many years at Hayes Lodgepole Schools. I taught as a paraprofessional under the bilingual programs in Harlem before that. And my aunt, Clarina Brockie, kept challenging me to go back to school. And a long time ago, I had an epiphany, and I dropped everything. I was like 17 or 18 credits short of a BS in ecology and biology at the University of Kansas. And I realized in my own family and on my Skinner side, which would be my maternal side of my dad's parents, I had a bunch of fluent speakers, and there was very few at the time in our tribe. And I felt, gosh, I have all these grandmothers and my grandpa that could talk Indian. And so I dropped everything and just came back and worked with one of my grandmothers at the time, or the late Madeline Cauliflower Skinner Cauliflower Cecilia, and then was her name Snake Woman. And I worked with her, and I worked with some various elders, Elmer Main, oh Watani. I worked with my grandpa, Nakatie, Nakek White Eagle, oh Nen Moses Nez Perce. And then finally, they all kind of shuffled me towards this lady. Her name was Begun A, and her name was Teresa Lamble, and she was a centurion. I think that's the term you say. And at the time, the college had a grant, the Aaniiih Nakota College, which was then Fort Belknap College at the time, had a grant through the Kellogg Foundation, a speaker learner program. And so all the stars kind of aligned, I guess you could say. And it started me on a journey in life that I'm still on. And I spent they would pay me $10 an hour for 10 hours a week to go sit with her. And the college was gracious enough to pay me mileage when I'd reach my 10 hours. And so I'd go sit with her for 5, 6 hours a day, or depending on how she was, for about 3 years. I mean, it was a long time. I just go out there maybe 3, 4 times a week, and we would talk into it. And she taught me to become as fluent as I can be. And I've, you know, and but the thing that I want to share, I guess, with the greater group is, when you think about a person she died when she was evidently 111, is how old she was. She was the oldest lady in Montana at the time. And I mean, the records, that's what the priest had at the church there at the mission when she was born. But there was always dispute, but it doesn't matter. She was pretty wise in her age. When you think about a person that age, saw the invention of cars and telephones and microwaves and airplanes and cell phones and you name it, all these things that we take for granted. And today she watched they evolve. And she talked to I have a story of her telling me when she lived in the teepee and they're picking berries with her grandmother. Grandmother raised her, and a bear came in the teepee, and her grandmother was telling her, "Be still, don't move. Let that bear have what it wants," and they laid there while that bear ate up all their berries they picked. I mean, this kind of gives you an idea of how old she was. But what she taught me was really to be a good human being. I learned tons of language, but what I learned from her was how to be a good human being. I hope I carry that legacy on for her. And that's really when you look at, and that's probably why I am such a huge language proponent, and why it's so important our heritage languages is because it is distinctly us, as whether you're Aaniiih or you're Lakota or you're Absalage or you're whatever tribe you are, it's distinctly you and your people, you know, Scott, Aaniiih, whatever it might be. And and unfortunately, there's no source to go to but right where we're at. A lot of the tribes, we are it. I mean, we can't go to Spain to learn Spanish. I mean, no, Mexico lost Spanish, they can go back to Spain. We can't do that. And so, And then you see, and I don't want to get into all the historical things, but basically when you have, your culture stripped from you, it's left a lot of dysfunction, a lot of historical trauma, and our kids sometimes they don't even know why. And that to me, every class that I've ever started, I say, if you could speak Indian, how many wish you could speak Indian right now? And every one of them innately would raise their hand. And and but it takes work. And I always wish I had a magic wand. I could touch them and they could just magically be fluent, but that just isn't the way it works. And but the our languages explain everything in our world, explains our kinship, our our connection to the natural world, our place, our our spirituality, our history, our stories, um, uh, our morale, our morality, our virtues. All these things are embedded in our language, and when that's stripped away from our children, and it's not their fault, and it might not be their parents' fault, and it might not be their great parent, their grandparents' fault, or it might not be their great just thought that's the way it is. There's a disconnect to that. Our children, even us, as we look in the mirror and we're Native American, but often I feel like we, as Native Americans, we question, exactly what is that? And so that's the road. When I say that, that's in the educational world, one of the biggest things that I learned from that was you're a lifelong learner, and it just never ends. And that's us as Indian people that fit really well with us as Dalwitz and. And so I got a class 7 and started teaching. And I didn't know anything about teaching, but I started teaching. And it's good to see that little one there. And I started teaching. And after about 4 or 5 years, I wanted to be more effective, I felt. So I took a sabbatical and went back to MSUB. And I mentioned Annette there earlier, and she was kind of head of that program actually for the college, and worked to get a elementary ed degree. And that really helped me meld kind of Western world education and traditional education, I felt like. And so, and often, I have some notes later in the class I'll put down to kind of, as if any of them, how many people are there, some class 7 teachers here? Anybody that actually teaches the language? I'm just kind of curious, you know, and but it's and if your support staff, also to support your fellow people that work, that are class 7 teachers in your schools. But I guess what I kind of want to talk about at first is uh my what I enjoy teaching the most, how I like teaching. And I there's a lot of different ways. I mean, there's like a lot of people know like what they call total physical response, and I know there's a gentleman named Stephen Gray Morning. There's the thingamajig. There's a lot of different ways, and there's models. I'm a language acquisition person. I feel like acquisition is the best route, and I feel like speaking is the number one thing. I think of Daryl Kipp, the late Daryl Kipp from Browning, and he said, and I feel like I'm not there yet, because he says, if you're not producing a fluent speaker, you're not doing anything. And there's a lot of truth to that. And so that's always my quest. And I'm the college I'm teaching right now, currently at Aaniiih College, and for this is the first year they've had a 3 and 4 class specifically to help prepare class 7 teachers to be in the classroom. So I'm excited about that, and they're taking me to even higher levels that I've never had a chance to teach to students, even in a high school setting. I mean, just certain things, and so that's been really enjoyable. But I don't like using there's the model. What I base my stuff off of is a thing called TPRS, teaching proficiency through reading and storytelling. But I don't really get into the storytelling stuff. What I like is what they call the wheeling of it, because I just want to get them to talk. And often, and I'm working hopefully through the language program. I've been translating our old traditional stories back into kind of a modern orthography. And then what I'm hopeful to do is then create curriculum for our teachers to then use to wheel off of that. And so, you know, I'll screen share real fast here and kind of show you the basis of it. And it's an acquisition model. There's a guy named Blaine Ray. I know. Uh, uh, I think it was Joanna. We brought him in that one time at a meeting in Bozeman one time, and so maybe some of you have seen it. But what the core of what I like to do is I like to let me see here if I can. I have to, there it is. Can everyone see that? Everyone see it?
Yes.
Yeah, great. And so it's a very simple process. I like to keep things simple. And I don't teach the reading so much and the writing. This is what I like. You can teach it, and it's a controlled environment. And what I mean by that is that I can kind of direct it and kind of there's certain content that I might want to teach to the students in a particular lesson, and I can keep control there. And if I need to like keep it at that level and just repeat that, I can. But if I see that they're mastering it, I can add some more content to it. And then I can engage with the kids and allow them to add to it and make it more relevant in their world. And it could be the students in the college even. And 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 sometimes the only one of the only fallacies I would say is you've got to elicit things from the students. You got to get them engaged. And some people like to get up in front, and they want it. Part of this model is they act things out. Other things is there can be captions, a written story, and then you read off of it there. But I so often I just want to be able to have them speak. That's always my goal, to speak. And so how it works, they call it wheeling. And basically, if you think about it, and I like because it works in a circle, and you start out and you just like make a statement, and then you want a yes answer, and you repeat that until they have it, and I mean, I'll just use English, for example, and I might have a sentence that says, there are two buffaloes standing out on the ground or out on the prairie. You know what I mean? And that's my statement. There's two buffaloes standing out on the prairie. And I go around to each student and I ask the question, I tell them first and I have a picture. I always like putting pictures up too, so they can visualize it. Because as Native people, I found that we're really visual learners and things. And so I'll put a picture up of whatever's going on, and so they establish meaning. And that's the most important thing, is you need to establish meaning with the student. And we'll go around, and I don't expect them to say it. I don't expect them to get it right. I don't expect them to read it. I just make the statement. And the first goal is for them just to repeat the statement. So then I start and I question them, are the two buffaloes standing on the prairie? And they might just be able to say, in the language, yes. Or they might say, Sid, no. And I'll model it again. And I'll say, "Ni sits on that, and that's neat. It's no be tawu at the be." And yes, the two buffalo are standing out on the prairie, way out there, and then once they kind of start to get that, then I'll also after that, then I'll introduce something new, and it could be see how it has on the left there, subject, verb, anything else. And so you could insert anything of those. You could manipulate the subject. You could manipulate. Maybe you want to work on verbs, and maybe you want to have them differentiate. Maybe the lesson is to differentiate between sitting, standing, lying down, and jumping or something. And so then I would say, are the two buffalo standing out on the prairie, or are the two buffalo sitting out on the prairie? And they already have the statement because of established meaning. The two buffalo are standing on the prairie. And they might say yes, and then you reiterate it, and encourage them. Neats, it's neats, it's say it, and it always doesn't come out right. And that's okay. And so you see them, and then you can keep going. And so I might say, is the buff are the buffalo are the buffalo standing on the prairie, or are they lying on the prairie? And so now you have lying introduced, and then you had sitting introduced, but your core word is standing. So you're focused on the verbs, right? And then are they standing on the prairie? Yes. And yes, yes, they're standing on the prairie. And then you start reiterating the negative sentence. And you might say, yes, yes, the two buffalo are standing on the prairie. The two buffalo are not lying on the prairie. The two buffalo are not sitting on the prairie. The two buffalo are standing on the prairie. And all you're worried about them doing is figuring out how to say the two buffalo are standing on the prairie. But they're getting lying and they're getting sitting, and you keep reiterating that. And then you would come back, and then after you feel like you've got them being able to say that sentence, then you can also, and the whole time they're getting questions, so they're learning how to ask a question or understanding a question. Now you can introduce a negative sentence. And you could say, are the two buffaloes sitting on the prairie? And you still want them to say that positive answer at first. If they can say that, that's great. And they might say, no, the two buffalo are standing on the prairie. And you'd say, yes, yes, they are. Yes, the two buffalo are standing on the prairie. They are not sitting on the prairie. And you continue to reiterate that. And maybe you come back and you say, are the two buffalo lying on the prairie? And it's the same thing. And over time they start to kind of figure it out. And then you can start to write it out if you want. You can write it out if you'd like, but I don't teach any grammatical rules because they hear it. And then you can maybe you have a special symbol in your language. You can say, oh, that says, a theta says a th sound, and then you just move on. And I don't even really talk about the reading portion of it really. And I just don't want to get caught up in that. But I may put the whole sentence out write it out on the board once they feel like they have confidence in at least trying to attempt to say it. And so then I'll come back after a while, I'll come back and I'll ask a yes again, and I'll ask them again. And then that's how I check for understanding, is I can ask them. And if they can answer me, I know I've got them there. And it also allows me to understand in the class, to evaluate the students. When you think about differentiated learning and how different kids learn different ways, you can see kids that look at the board and their reading skills are really good. You can hear kids that are like their ears really good, and they internalize spoken language really fast, and they break it up. And so they kind of understand what means what and where. You can see kids that you can see kids that are still struggling, and you can kind of work through and find out what their strengths, what their weaknesses are. So maybe I use the verb, like for example, and now I might incorporate a subject, and change the subject, right? So there was two buffaloes, now I might say, are there two buffaloes standing on the prairie, or are there two horses standing on the prairie? And maybe now the subjects I want to learn are buffalo, horse, and wolf, and I do the same process again. Are there two buffaloes standing on the prairie? Or are there two horses standing on the prairie? Oh, yes, there's two buffaloes standing on the prairie. Then I reiterate the negative. There is not two, and and uh and so that's one way that I kind of, and I'm using this wholly to teach nouns and verbs pretty much. Because really what I want to get to eventually, and I go through that process, but really what I want to get to is first person and second person speaking. Me saying, are you standing? Yes, I am standing. You know what I mean? Are you not standing? No, I am not. Am I standing? Yes, I am. And get them into that first and second where we're just like talking. But I want to establish meaning. So I'll talk about it in kind of third person first, using something. And so as I go through that, I can once I get through there and they kind of get the sentence straight up, then I might I introduce different animals. Introduce different verbs. I could introduce place. I could focus on the place now. Are the two buffaloes standing on the prairie, or are they standing in the lake? Are the two buffaloes standing in the prairie, or are they standing in the mountains? Are the two buffaloes standing in the prairie, or are they standing in the river? Now all of a sudden they're learning about river, they're learning about mountains, and they're just hearing it over and over and over. And you're reiterating the main statement. The two buffalo are standing on the prairie. They're not standing on the lake. They're not standing in the lake. You could say on, you could teach on and focus on. You could teach relative location you know, in the water. There's a word in our language for in the water. There's all these, we're very descriptive in our languages as those that teach language understand that. And so you can use that to teach all these different places. You can introduce time concepts. And that's one thing that I'll talk a little bit about time. And we're spatial learners. I don't know if any of you guys ever read God is Red by Vine Deloria, but I think it's like chapter 3 or 4. Vine Deloria talks about spatial and temporal time, and that's really true in our language. We're spatial learners. We don't talk in increments of like a millisecond, a second, an hour, like a month, a week, a month, a year. All that. We talk about, oh, the sun's coming into sight, the sun's in the middle, the sun's past the middle, it's going out of sight, it's dark, it's night, it's day. That's how we spatially think about things. And so you can introduce that, and introduce new concepts, like for example, like, and philosophy to that too. So I might, like when you use like concepts of time, okay, we just have like nohwani usin, or nohani, which means today, anhus, yesterday, and nokek, which means tomorrow. And we just say tomorrow and loosely translate it means tomorrow. But there's a teaching lesson there just culturally. And that's the thing, is as you teach, it's not just teaching the language. I encourage you as language teachers, or is to infuse the culture at every aspect, at every aspect. When you talk about the buffalo, you could talk about the importance of that buffalo and how it's like we had a symbiotic relationship with it. We still do. But you could also talk about, like, here's a good example of tomorrow. Tomorrow, the way we say it, if it means if it's dawn. That's literally what the word means. Nalkek means if it's dawn. And so there's an implied meaning that, we might, we don't know if it's going to be dawn or not. And so that you can reiterate a cultural teaching of why it's important that we make smudge, we make prayer in the morning, like when the sun comes up. When the sun goes down, that's our kind of our Aaniiih way. Make prayer when the sun goes down. That's kind of the way we're supposed to do things, kind of like in Nokgun, in dawn, and then in Doa, in evening, right after you, kind of like Mike Jetty's picture there. He's kind of like right in the twilight of dawn and dusk, like that. And so, those are things that, there's cultural teachings that exist in that, and I really encourage you, because like I was saying, that lack of our children, our students, not, unfortunately, they're not always getting good, sound cultural teachings in their home. And this is an opportunity for kids and students to be able to be exposed to some of the cultural aspects. And I encourage teachers, and especially of the culture, I mean, to lay it all out there and don't be worried about anything. Don't be worried about, stepping on anybody's toes, because it's like, you know, I can remember I had the 7 essential understandings, big old poster on my wall. And one day I was looking at it and I was reading them, just sitting there in my classroom. And I said, what do my kids actually know about these? You know, we kind of assume they know things, but they don't understand many of those things. And so, how do I infuse those within the language in a lesson so that they can grasp some of those essential understandings and really understand how distinct we are, each of our respective tribes. And that's really important for identity. And I'll give you an example. Today, I was doing this same process teaching, and and it was with emotions. And there was just a whole cultural lesson under that. And, I can like quickly, I don't know how we doing with time. Okay, we're doing okay. And let me start down here and show you really quickly what I was showing them. And this is what I mean by like how we do things in our language, right? And so, you know, uh in English, like it's Valentine's Day. Here's a good example. Valentine's Day is tomorrow. And maybe I buy flowers for my wife and I get her candy and I'll take her to dinner and we have a date and all these things. And she says, "Oh gosh, you're so nice to me. It just touched my heart." And all of a sudden, when we express things in English, it's like our heart is very important. But to us, you know, but that's our heart. That's our heart. And that's what runs everything. And often emotions are in the brain in English, you know what I mean? It's like think you would in English here, but for us it's out of our heart. And so that's kind of where we're at there. And so there's a word in our language, it's a derivative of that, it's da. And so that's where everything starts. And then we have another derivative of our word, and it's awe. And so that means it's like becoming, it'd be like saying, uh, I might say, not gay, no, I say, and I use, or I say, not gay, no, oh, no, I'm getting tired. I'm not tired yet. I'm getting tired. And so, and that's what that awe represents. And then I have like, you could say, it saw, and I'm just typing these up. I hope you guys can see them. And so, each of these means, one means heart, and this next one is becoming a certain way, I guess you could say, is the best way I could say it. Now it
We
saw
we
means,
cannot see your words if you're typing them.
okay, let me make them bigger. Can you see them now?
What we're seeing is your make statement, yes.
Oh, okay. All right. Let me
Maybe,
stop. Let me
maybe,
reshare.
maybe.
Yeah, I'll reshare. New share. There we go. I'm sorry. Thanks for speaking up and letting me know. So I have bit da, there's my heart, and then this is a derivative of your heart, it da, and then I have aw, becoming a certain way. And it saw means to use like mental capacity or mental or thoughts. Okay. And then you have like a a dao, which means your breath, right? And and then you have Aaniiih, Aaniiih, I'll just say Aaniiih then. And this means speech, okay? And you could have, off of that, you could have Aaniiih, which is a state of being. And this is kind of a long-winded thing, but this is like what I mean by like philosophy that's embedded in our language, right? And so everything starts with our heart. And so I was teaching emotions, and I was telling them about these different things. And so I could say, um, uh, like uh, like I might say, "Niet daha." I might use this term right here. "Niet daha no." And I say, I have a good heart. And then I could say, oh no, I'm starting to being good. I'm starting to live a good way. And then I might say, "Niet so no." My thoughts are good. And and not yeah, I have good breath. I have a good healthy path. Like, and then I could say, I speak well. And I could say, I'm in the state of being good. And so these things, they reiterate how we're supposed to be as human beings. And it's through emotion. And it's just an example of like, and I could use, I was wheeling them with this, and I was teaching about different ways and how things, you know, this could be like here from this place, and this just means I'm doing an action, to do an action. So I could start from my heart, I could get that way, I could have good thoughts, I could have good breath and good speech. And so it's like the analogy I always use with my students is like, how many times have you said something to someone you love, and the minute the words came out of your mouth, you wish you could catch them and stuff them back in your mouth? You know, that's the kind of, it teaches us to be a critical thinker and speak before we, you know, I mean, think before we speak, have a good heart before we think, you know. And so these are examples. So like even like this, like here's a word in our language that means to think. This is literally what it means to think. Okay. I might say asitsa, think. And so there's your mental activity right there. See, it saw, you can see it right here. Okay. But this right here, there's another I there, but that means before. That's what that word means. Before you have mental thoughts, because your heart is guiding you. This is philosophy that helps us. Um, I can use this same word and I can say sin it saw. Okay. And I might say, no, I am. And this is equals to I am, I am sad. Okay. And literally what that word means is I stopped thinking. I stopped thinking. So I became irrational, really. And so there's environmental controls within our language and our culture that teach us that if I'm sad, that's not the norm. And it reminds me of that I should, you know, have a Aaniiih saw, you know what I mean? Good thoughts. And so these are kind of just similar, just different teachings that help us understand our language. And I can teach all that. Um, I can teach all that through let me share again here. Righty, I think I'm sharing. Yeah, there it is. And I can teach all that just through this basic pathway. And so, you know, those are some things that I like to use, and it can go on and on. You could teach place. Remember, I was telling you all the different things our culture teaches us. I could start teaching our place names, you know, or the two buffalo, and I'm going back to my basic sentence. The two buffalo are standing out in the prairie. I could say, are the two buffalo at the Bear Paw Mountains? Are the two buffaloes at the Little Rocky Mountains? Are the two bear paws at the Elk River? Are the two are the two buffalo at the Missouri River? You know, and you could teach place names. You know, you could teach now they learn how to say Havre in their traditional language, how they learn how to say Malta, how they learn how to say Billings, how they learn how to say the Snowy Mountains in central Montana. You know, all these, you can teach all that through this simple process, you know, and it's slow, and it's just like making sure that they know how to say that base sentence, but they're learning all this fluff. And then you can provide supplemental. That's where you have to provide your supplemental stuff. And that's the challenge, everyone. I understand that is we can't go to, what is it, Harcourt or whatever it is, then, and order our a full set of our language and have all the supplemental material and worksheets. And you know, we get that one prep period, and we got to create our curriculum, you know, grade papers, plan for the next week, all in one. So as teachers in the school systems, I encourage you to really speak with your administrators and kind of explain that specific dilemma that we often find. And you don't have to reinvent the wheel either. That's the other thing, you know. And that was a couple of the things that I did want to talk, you know, was find a network of teachers. If there's a few teachers that teach the language within your tribe, you know, network with them. Make sure you guys are, you know, teaching similar content and vocabulary so that, you know, we can make this language living. And what I mean by that is out in the public, not just in a classroom and the kid walks out the door and then he's back to English. That say a kid from Hayes Lodgepole can go down to and visit with a kid in Harlem and at least begin to speak with one another in the language, you know, and you know, we've got to make it living, and that's very, very important. that we make it living, because everywhere around us is English on our phones, English on the TV, English on text, everything. It just everything is English. And that's the challenging that we have, is how do you infuse that ownership into the individual student, that they make the choice. And that's a good feeling. That's a good feeling as a second language learner, when you subconsciously choose to speak your language first before you do it in English. And that's kind of where you want these learners to be, where you may say their name, maybe it's an Indian, and they turn around and they say, ah, yo, what, in the language, as opposed to saying what in English. That's a good feeling, because, oh, naturally, I chose my language over a language that was imposed on me, even though I've known it from birth. And so those are some things, that I think are very important. I'm going to stop this share, and I'm going to kind of go back to that other document, and I think of let's see here, where'd it go? I lost it here. Just one second. Okay. Let me make this a little bit bigger, and see, I'll share this. All right. Sorry about that, everyone. Right here. Okay. There we go. All righty. And let me see if I can make this a little bit bigger. A couple of things that I wrote out, and I'll bring this down a little bit because I'm sure you can see it, is, just for teachers, be prepared on a daily basis and throughout the school year. And that's even in the summer, taking time to work on things and prepare for the school year, because I know we're off for the summer, but there's a time when this is a chance you get to get ahead of it, and create some things that you don't have maybe in your one prep period a day throughout the year to get things done. Force yourself to be technologically savvy is the best word I'd have to say. Always be looking for different ways of technology. We live in a technological world, and unfortunately, and I'm not saying this is the way of but our kids it's got to be relevant in the language. I mean, the language evolved from when we had dogs, to when we had horses, to when we had wagons, to when we had cars, planes, phones, computers, on and on. And how do you, with the kids today, how do you make it their world? And you've got to kind of force yourself to kind of get them at least hooked. And so at the same time, it's just like as simple as stuff is understanding the student attendance system that you're at your respective school. How administrators have different ways they want you to put your lesson plans in. Some are real strict about it, others are a little bit more lax, they just want to see them. And some schools have really in-depth technological platforms. Force yourself to learn them. Remember, students, and this is one of the things with a class 7 teacher, sometimes we're not formally educated, and we don't get educational theories and ways to deliver. We just, sometimes a person they're just a fluent speaker, and they hey, you speak Indian, come teach. And so, but they have no skills of teaching. So seek out a mentor, a good teacher, to help you plan, help you learn how to get through the technology. Know that students learn in various ways, and one way, one delivery does not work every time. I use, like I was that's the basis, my wheeling, but like I use a lot of drawing. I make them draw stuff out, I make them draw out actions, I make them act out actions, I make them draw out different things, and then I through questioning, I ask them different things about that, and make it kinesthetic. There's differentiated learning. Every child learns differently. Are you scaffolding the learner? Are you getting them to a certain place, and then and then moving them to another. One thing I didn't put in there is like, that's the basis. That's why I like it. It's inquiry learning, and I always felt like inquiry learning is the best way to learn in my world. That's the way I learned, but I'm not saying that every kid learns that way, but instead of like giving them the answer, questioning them, even in the language to elicit the answer and scaffold them to a new level. And so you're constantly moving them up and challenge them with higher order thinking skills. I mean, as teachers, we know Bloom's taxonomy, you might say. There's a whole bunch of stuff. Start in the, I just want them to identify it. I want them to define it. I want them to just speak it. Now let's change that, infuse other things in there. Today, we're losing more and more speakers. And I have down here established go-to elders. I really don't have any anymore. I used to have someone that I could, like, even when I was teaching in Hayes, I could race down and go. If I didn't know how to say something, I didn't know how to put a sentence together, I could go down in my prep and go see an elder and itas and hitan so-and-so and ask them how they say this or that. And then it was meaningful because I wanted to be able to say that, and it was meaningful learning, and I would never forget it. And you know, know your grammar, your language, be able to like break things down and not just, I mean, and that's a challenge for like fluent speakers, first language speakers. They just speak it. But I challenge you as first language speakers to be able to break those words down and kind of explain those concepts, because that's the cool stuff the kids like that I've found, when you're able to like explain how we're supposed to be. Most tribal languages are descriptive and verb based. So they tell you how you're supposed to be. Just like I use sadness, sin itza. It's telling me that I'm not using my mind properly. I'm not being irrational. I'm not being rational, I should say. you know um and so these are just some things, that just basic notes that I had put down, that if you have elders in your tribe, have a few of them, go spend time with them if you're a teacher, to constantly even so that you can elicit these old words that might be archaic, but you can use them. The beauty of our language, and I can't speak for every tribe's language in Montana, but most are verb based, as I said, so that all you have to do is describe a new thing. And that's the challenge, even as teachers. There's so many new things, like I was like the class, my higher level classes at the college, I was asking them, eat us and heat on World Wide Web, eat us and heat on, air fryer, eat us, and I was throwing out all these abstract things that are real world. Eat us and heat on a treadmill, I mean, all these things, but we can describe them. And so that's the thing, is for a language to evolve and continue to thrive, it's got to be adaptable to your current situation, where you're at in your state, and constantly search. This is probably one of the biggest things. Constantly search, ask yourself the whys of your language. Think deeply, think critically of your language. How how do things work? Why are they that way? There's just so many connections, because what I always tell my students is, like, our heart is our heart of our language is the verb, and you can use it in so many different ways, and as you build it out and you learn more things out of that verb, it creates a worldview and a philosophy that is distinctly Aaniiih, and it's not English, it's not a meld of Aaniiih and English, it's Aaniiih, genuinely, itabya. It is the truth, it's genuine. And so those are just some things that I thought I would share today. Kind of what couple, that I just shared a couple things. I mean, it depends on the age of the students you're teaching too. Like that, like the wheeling portion of what I was showing you earlier with the questions, yes, no, either or, and all that. I usually use that with higher level kids, because a lot of times they're kind of, they don't want to be jumping around, where you could use some TPR with little kids, and remember their attention spans about that. And one thing that I do want to talk about with, that teaching, is sometimes as teachers, we get some students, maybe we get two or three of them, boy, they're really starting to talk Indian. And thinking of differentiated learning, you got some kids that are maybe not quite at their level, and you get so excited because you want to talk with people in your your heritage language. You just want to talk Indian, and it feels really good. You got to always tell yourself to slow down, and make sure that you're being inclusive and bringing everyone along, because you can be bringing that, maybe the kid is struggling a little bit with the concept, but you can also be reiterating that same concept with him and teaching higher order skills with some other students, so you can kind of balance it out and still keep the core of what you're trying to teach and deliver in that specific lesson. So, those were a few things. I was just looking at some of my notes, but I think I kind of covered what I wanted to. Matthew asked me to save a little bit of time for some questioning, and so yep, there went my phone there. So yeah, I had it on timer, so that worked out just right. And so uh I'm not all knowing. I love my Indian ways, and I love the identity that our language teaches us, and it's true. Itawu, we say. That's how we say it. It's true, and it's bataya, it's holy, it's sacred. It's in our belief system, and we struggle with that as Indian people. That's one thing before I ask for, is I struggled because we always have in the Western world separation of church and state and all that. In the Indian way, we just have a spiritual way of us. It's in us, and it's in the language, and there's no way to. It's like meat, like the word athan in our language, and atheha, a Sundance Lodge. They're derived out of the same word, so you can't separate them. I mean, just a T-bone steak is a than, and athe basically is a derivative of a than, and vice versa. So you can't separate things. So don't be afraid, and don't make excuses, and don't demean to the man, as I guess I would say. We're past those days as Indian people. We're sovereign people, and remember that we're sovereign people, and we're distinct people. And even though systems of the state are there, and I'm not bashing the state because the state's sponsoring this, but remember, you want your kids to know who they are in their environment, within their own lands and in their own country. And I encourage you, those 7 essential understandings, make sure you infuse something of that in your lessons, even if it's in English and you have to deliver it in English. Make sure that they understand who they are, where they come from, how they came to be, from a traditional aspect, but also their place in this modern world from a, kind of an interaction between the United States and tribes. So I'll be quiet. If there's any questions, fire away.
And thank you for sharing, Terry. I got a question for you.
Yeah.
Did you ever like with your kids have them do jokes in the tribal language in Aaniiih? It's like
You,
or tell a
you know,
story that was funny or something.
well, not too much. Here's a kind of an interesting anecdote. I had a student that was autistic, and he would, it was like, and autism is a different form of learning. There's nothing, it's just a different form. And orally, I could tell the student once, and it was just like they just understood it. I would put things on the board in a written text, and it was just like the student couldn't understand it. It just didn't even make sense to them. But they would constantly do puns in the language with me, and even it was so subtle. He'd do puns with me in the language, and I was just like, I'd have to think for a second, and it was like, so I mean, that's kind of maybe one thing. But it was kind of crazy because a linguist that worked with our tribe and did a dictionary, he passed away a couple years ago, and his children were going through like all his records, and they found a bunch of texts of like 15 stories, and there's like about 5 of them that are really humorous jokes in the language too. So there's an opportunity, to your point, of using those. There's kind of puns in there and stuff. It's kind of interesting. That was kind of one of the things, is like every tribe's different. Some tribes have lots of speakers still, some have very few, some have no first language speakers left. You know what I mean? And so the vibrancy of the language varies from tribe to tribe, and from speaker to speaker, often They're far away from one another even. So, any other questions?
Thanks for sharing that. I just asked because Dick Littleberry, one of our buddies there, says
Yeah,
jokes in Cheyenne are way more funny than they are in English.
yeah,
Because of how
yeah.
things
Well,
translate.
like a good example is like I always, one thing I kind of joke with was it's like so like to use the bathroom in our language, we say like no go no no go, and it means it literally means no means to go outside of an enclosure, and go means to do it really quick. And so you got to think about the term of going to the bathroom. We were in a teepee back then. So if we had to go to the bathroom, we ran outside, right? And so we still use that word, but everything is inside. So a kid I can remember kids raising their hand. No go, no. They'd say, I need to go to the bathroom. And I'd say, oh, one no go, sin no go, ni. None. I tell them, go run outside to the run outside house, and everything's inside. So it's just kind of crazy language. So the way we do things, so it's descriptive. So there's comical. That's what he means. Is like the descriptiveness of the language. It's comical. I could tell you some really crazy stories that are probably not the best platform here in the language, that are just comical, but they're kind of a little bit on the racy side. But again, and that's what I struggle. There's a good example of like Aaniiih stories, or Tomi stories, or Napi stories, or Wisagachuk stories. They're often told very crudely in Western society views, you know, and 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 you struggle. This is one of the struggles I had, was, do I teach it with the watered down version, or do I teach it, straight ahead? Because if you think about Napi or Tomi or Aaniiih, they embody all of man, all of humanity. They're good, they're bad, they're evil, they're great, they're holy, they're stingy, they're great saviors of the people, they're rapists, they're sodomists, they chase their mother-in-law. I mean, there's all these things that they do. And I believe there's a genuineness to that, because if you told those stories the way they are, the young child sitting around in the campfire long ago would learn that this guy's a guy that is pretty crazy, and we probably shouldn't do that. You see what I mean? Maybe it's probably not a good idea to be a rapist. It's not a good idea to be a sodom. It's not a good idea to do these crazy things. But then at the same time, he does stuff that's really great and holy for the betterment of the people too. But it's all, see, that's what I mean. That individual teaches us to have balance. You see, knowing that we're fallible, knowing that we can embody Aaniiih a little bit here and there, but we try to just keep balanced in life. And that's a really fundamental teaching. And so I always struggled on, like, how should I deliver it? So I just tell it the way it is. And right, wrong, and different, I would tell it the way it is. So, because I feel like I'm doing a disservice to my ancestors behind me, because that's the way they would tell that, those stories were told, you know? And so that's kind of, in Western world, where you're like, ooh, gee, you're teaching them about, raping and all this stuff. But at the same time, that was to teach them not to be that way. You see what I mean? And that there's a lot of genuineness to that, to be a good human being, And so, I mean, that's really the core of what the language teaches us: how to be a good human being, how to be a good relative, how to be a loving individual, how to have peace in your heart, how to be harmonious in the environment that you live within. It's not, putting war paint on and going to battle, We want to mystify all that, but really what it boils down to is an Indian wants to be good, be a good relative. And that's to all things in creation in our belief system. That's really what, and a heart full of love, heart full of compassion, but be brave when you have to be brave. That's because that's our life way, that's our pathway. And it's we instead of I, it's inclusive. And that's the battle that we have with Western society. No disrespect, but it's just, it's an individualistic society, capitalism, entrepreneurship. Why are people coming to America? Because they can do anything they want, you see? And it's just kind of a different worldview, It's just, nothing's wrong, nothing right. I'm not saying one's right or wrong. I'm just saying it's just a different worldview. But any other questions? I mean, about the language or anything?
Um, Terry, I had a quick question.
Yeah.
Um, have you found like one or two or a good way to grade your class, like a grading rubric that worked really well?
Yeah, well, I mean, for me, like speaking, okay, and I'll be kind of candid, okay? And that in the westernized world of education, they want rubrics, they want
Hmm.
grading, they want all these things. And you have to somewhat adapt to that in that system. But as a language teacher, you just want your kids to speak.
Hmm.
You want your kids to have some sort of self-identity, some sort of understanding of who they are, where they come from. They know where they come from. They know a little bit of their history. They might know a song, something,
Hmm.
that gives them a positive light. So I always weighted mine on speaking. Like,
Hmm.
like, like I always weighted it on speaking because and really it was in the questions. You see what I mean? It was in the question portion of it. And so, I'm not really focused so much on reading, it's more speaking. So with the grading of mine, that's how I did it. In my college class, I have a
Hmm.
final and a midterm, and that's it. And 65% of your grade is attendance because it's like math, I mean, it's like I mean, it's like, say you're taking a microbiology class. There's all kinds of language in there of all this scientific stuff. And unless you're in that field of study, you never hear that language. You don't hear about mitochondria and all these different things like that are in a cell. You learn it in school, but and so I have targeted language and I want them to speak. A good example, like John Stiffarm, who's a Aaniiih teacher, he'll bring them out and he'll just set them down in a chair and he'll ask them orally, and that's how he grades them. You know, and where I would do it more blanketly with that, you know what I mean? And so I my goal really wasn't to grade them, because think about this. Kids, we already have enough historical trauma as it is, and we don't even know we have it. And we're nervous about trying to speak our language because someone said, "Boy, don't you say something. If you say it this way, it means this." And there's some truth sometimes to that, but it's all fear-based, this kind of dogma that's been infused on our people. And so the psyche of the kid who just wants to speak, you see what I mean? And to have an F or a D on there. I don't ever want my student walking out the door saying, "God, I'm never going to learn my language." And because of a viewing a test, because there's an F on it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And
Yep.
that's not fair to my people as our language, because it's just like we're teaching language in the school because westernized educational methods placed it there, where really the language should be spoken around the dinner table in our homes. But we didn't have that choice. You think about it, Native Americans and African Americans in this country are the only two people that had a forced way. We didn't have a choice. We did not have a choice. It was forced on us. Anybody else that immigrated from another country, if they wanted to, they're Jewish and they wanted to keep their Jewish ways, or they're from Ethiopia, and they want to keep some of their tradition, they can keep that. And they can, meld into American society, but all the things that they have, they can keep that. We didn't have that choice. We're scrapping and clawing to keep what we have, to hold on to what we have. And so I'm kind of like a little bit resistant to the westernized world of education sometimes. I'm kind of on the radical, a little bit of aim in me, maybe. I don't know. Hey, fight the power. But no, but that's just my kind of opinion on things, though, that way.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah,
Thanks.
you bet. You bet. Glad you joined, Jessica. Yeah. Any other questions people might have? All right.
Thanks for your time,
Yeah.
Terry.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you all for joining, and keep fighting the good fight. It's just and thank all, and I see a lot of people from OPI, and I thank you guys all for, continue to perpetuate our language. And I see past Professor Emeritus, I would imagine, is Joanna there. I mean, I don't know. I think she's retired now, but there's different people there. But I'm really glad and honored to be able to speak today. So I thank you all. Aaniiih.
All right. Well, for those of you who joined us, stay tuned next week. We'll have Aoife across the content. Same time, same bat place. Well, no, different Zoom link for that one, sorry. That would be Jennifer Statham.